The deer was gone. Elira pressed 2 fingers into the last hoofprint and felt it, already softening, the edges crumbling beneath fresh powder that the wind kept throwing sideways in sheets. 2 hours. She had tracked this animal for 2 hours through cold so absolute it had stopped being painful somewhere around the second ridge and become simply silence. A numbness that lived in the bones and asked no permission. She rose and turned her face into the wind out of habit. Direction, temperature, what it carried. Tonight it carried one thing: more snow. She needed to go back. Frostfang Hollow was a half-hour's run through familiar pine corridors, and even that margin was shrinking fast. Elder Torvald had warned the hunters at dawn. Anyone caught beyond the valley ridge when a blizzard hit stays beyond it. No rescue parties. No second chances. The pack did not waste strength on wolves who made poor decisions. Elira had never made a poor decision in her life. She turned toward camp and stopped. The wind shifted, just for a moment, just a single breath between gusts. And underneath it, so thin and brief she nearly swallowed it whole and kept walking, came a sound. High, desperate, alive. She stood absolutely still. An animal, she told herself. A fox kid, a trapped rabbit, the storm playing tricks on tired ears. Then it came again, and her body moved before her mind had finished constructing arguments. Not toward camp. Down. Into the ravine to the east, where the pines grew so dense the snow barely reached the ground, and the shadows between the trunks looked like held breath. She didn't decide to go. She simply went. Before we continue, please hit the subscribe and like button and tell me which city you're tuning in from. I love to know where this story found you. Now let's dive in. She smelled blood before she saw the trap. Iron. Old iron with rust along the hinge, the kind the lowland hunters set and forgot about when the season turned. She crouched behind a deadfall and scanned the clearing before she entered. Habit, always habit. And then she saw it, caught in the teeth of the trap's lower jaw. One small silver paw. The pup was tiny. Younger than anything had a right to be out here alone. His fur was the color of fresh snowfall in moonlight, almost luminous even in the dark, and he was shaking so violently she could see it from 5 feet away. He had tried to pull free. The blood on the snow told her how long he had been trying. When her shadow fell over him, he lifted his head and attempted a growl. It came out barely louder than a breath. "Oh, little one." She did not reach for him immediately. She crouched and made herself still and let him smell her. Her hands, her cloak, the remnants of pine resin and wood smoke she always carried. His growl faded. His ears, flat against his skull, lifted slightly. Then he did something that undid her completely. He licked her fingers. Just once, weakly, like a question. Elira's chest did something complicated. She knew the law. Every wolf in Frostfang Hollow knew it by heart before they were old enough to hunt. No pup of unknown blood may be brought within pack borders. The rule was not cruelty, or that is what the elders always said. It was caution carved from old war, yet from the memory of shapeshifter spies who had once walked through pack gates disguised as abandoned young, as helpless and pitiful and impossible to refuse as this small creature right here. Compassion was the weapon they had used against the packs once. The elders had made sure it would never work again. Elira pried open the trap. The mechanism was stiff with cold, and she had to brace her knee against the ground and use both hands, and the pup whimpered once, sharp and frightened. And then it released, and she gathered him against her chest before she had consciously chosen to, wrapping her cloak around the both of them, pressing warmth into his shaking body with her hands. He stopped shaking within minutes. He tucked his nose under her chin. His scent reached her then, fully, past the blood and the fear and the iron, and something in the deep animal part of her went very quiet, the way the forest went quiet before something enormous moved through it. His scent was wrong for a stray, wrong for a rogue. It was old, layered in a way that made her think of high stone halls and banners she had never seen, and power that had nothing to do with Frostfang Hollow. She did not understand it. She stood, pulled her cloak tighter around him, and looked once toward camp. Then she began to walk. The blizzard had made up its mind. By the time Ailira climbed out of the ravine, the pine corridor she had used as a landmark was barely visible, just a dark suggestion behind walls of moving white. The wind had shifted again, coming now from the northeast, which meant the temperature was still dropping and would keep dropping until well past midnight. She adjusted the pup against her chest and kept moving. He had stopped shivering. That was either a good sign or a very bad one, and she pressed 2 fingers gently against his ribs until she felt it. The small, rapid drumbeat of his heart, fast but steady. Good then. His paw had bled through the edge of her cloak already, a faint rust-coloured bloom against the grey wool. She needed to clean and wrap it properly. She needed warmth and her medicine pouch and the dried moss she kept for deep puncture wounds. She needed to get home. She ran, not recklessly. The ground beneath the snow was uneven, and a twisted ankle out here tonight was a death sentence. But with the efficient, ground-eating stride she had spent years building, the kind that covered distance without announcing itself, the pup made no sound against her chest. Once she glanced down and found him watching her face with eyes that caught what little light the storm allowed and held it, 2 faint coins of silver in the dark. She looked away and kept running. The lights of Frostfang Hollow appeared through the tree line 40 minutes later, torch glow bleeding orange through the snow, the outer wall silhouette familiar and solid and, for the first time in her life, slightly less welcoming than it should have been. She slowed before she reached the gate, stood there a moment with the wind at her back and the pup tucked warm and quiet beneath her cloak, and thought about what she was carrying. Not just the weight of him, the fact of him, an unknown pup, no bloodline she could name, no pack scent she could identify. The law was not subtle on this point. Elder Torvald had read it aloud at her first pack council, and she had been 7 years old, and she had understood it perfectly. What we cannot verify, we cannot protect. What we cannot protect, we cannot keep. She should leave him at the tree line, set him down in the roots of the old sentinel pine, where the wind didn't reach, go inside, come back with food, and... The pup shifted, pushed his nose out from the gap in her cloak, and turned his face up toward hers. His eyes caught the torchlight now, and she saw it clearly for the first time. The faint luminescence she had half dismissed in the ravine as a trick of shadow. It was not a trick. His irises held a dim silver glow, like moonlight trapped behind glass, and it faded even as she watched, dimming back to ordinary dark as though her attention had startled it away. She stared at him, and he blinked, slow and trusting, and tucked his nose back against her collarbone. Ailira exhaled. Then she walked to the gate and knocked twice. Bram was on watch, which was either fortunate or the opposite. She hadn't decided yet. He was young, only 2 years into his first rotation, and he still had the quality of not quite knowing which rules to enforce rigidly and which to pretend he hadn't noticed. He opened the viewing slot, saw her, unbolted the gate. Then he saw the shape beneath her cloak, and his hand stopped on the second bolt. Alera. He's injured, she said. Caught in an iron trap beyond the East Ravine. His paw needs wrapping. Bram looked at her the way people looked at someone who was saying one thing and meaning something far more complicated. His eyes dropped to the small silver head now visible at the gap in her cloak, then rose back to her face. You know what Elder Torvald will? Yes, she said. A long silence. Snow collected on Bram's shoulders. The torch above the gate hissed in the wind. He slid the second bolt. She walked through without another word, and behind her she heard him close the gate slowly, carefully, like a man who was already deciding he had seen nothing at all tonight. The pack was sleeping. For now, that was enough. She almost made it to morning. By the time Elira had cleaned the pup's paw, packed the wound with dried moss and bound it in linen, and settled him into the wool blanket beside her hearth, the blizzard had quieted to a low moan outside her walls. She had watched him sleep for a while, the way his small chest rose and fell, and the way his silver fur dried into something impossibly soft in the firelight, and allowed herself, briefly, to believe that the hard part was over. Then came the knock. Not Bram's knock. Bram knocked like someone hoping you wouldn't answer. This knock had knuckles in it. Authority. She opened the door to 3 pack wolves she didn't know well, and one she knew too well. Mira, her nearest neighbour, stood at the back of the group with her arms crossed and her eyes fixed on a point somewhere above Elira's left shoulder. She had the look of someone who had told herself she'd had no choice. The council will see you, the lead wolf said. Now. They were all there. The council hall was the oldest structure in Frostfang Hollow, low-ceilinged, stone-floored, smelling permanently of tallow smoke and old judgments, and 7 elders sat in a crescent behind the long table, and Elder Torvald Greymantle occupied the centre seat, the way a mountain occupied a valley, without apology and without the faintest suggestion that it had ever considered being anywhere else. He was a large man, gone grey at the temples, with a hunter's hands and a bureaucrat's eyes, pale and very still, and always slightly ahead of whatever you were saying. Elira stood before the table with the pup in her arms. She had not left him alone. That had been her first decision of the morning, and probably her most telling one. Torvald studied the small silver wolf for a long moment without speaking. Around the hall, pack members lined the walls, more than should have been awake at this hour, which meant word had travelled fast and deliberately. Bram, somewhere near the back, was studying the ceiling. Set it on the table, Torvald said. His paw is wrapped. I'd rather not. Set it on the table, Elira. She set him down gently. The pup stood on 3 legs, held his bandaged paw off the stone, and looked at the 7 elders with an expression of calm curiosity that seemed to unsettle them more than fear would have. Torvald leaned forward, studied the fur, the build, the eyes. He reached out and the pup allowed it, which Elira noted, because most animals did not allow Torvald Greymantle anything. Unknown bloodline, he said finally. He sat back. No pack scent I recognize. He was alone in the East Ravine, Elira said, caught in an iron trap. He would have been dead by morning. Perhaps, said Elder Voss, a narrow woman on Torvald's left. That was the intended outcome. Murmurs moved through the hall like wind through grass. Rogue spawn, someone said near the wall. Or worse. Voss folded her hands on the table. You are all young enough to have learned the old wars from stories. Some of us learn them differently. Shapeshifter hunters send pups ahead of their parties. small, helpless, designed to be found, designed to be carried exactly where we are standing now. Her eyes moved to the pup with something that was not quite cruelty, but was close enough to be uncomfortable. One act of compassion, one unlocked gate, one throat cut in the dark. Silence. Elira felt the weight of it, the genuine fear beneath the procedure, the real history behind the law. She had always understood it intellectually. Standing here, she found she still couldn't make herself care. "He's only a child," she said. "We cannot verify that," Torvald said. "Look at him." "We are looking at him?" His voice did not rise. It never did. "That is precisely the problem." He placed both hands flat on the table, and the hall went quieter, in a way that had nothing to do with volume. The law is not a suggestion we revisit when it inconveniences us. No pup of unknown blood may be sheltered within pack borders. Not for a night. Not for an hour. He held her gaze. "You will take the animal beyond the valley before sunrise. Leave him at the base of the northern ridge and return alone." The pup had found his way back to the edge of the table. He was leaning, very slightly, against Elira's arm. She looked down at him. Then she looked back at Torvald. "No," she said. The word landed in the hall like something dropped from a great height. "No." For a moment nobody moved. Then everyone moved at once. Voices breaking across each other, bodies shifting, the careful formality of the council dissolving into something older and less managed. Elira heard her name said in tones she had never heard attached to it before. Traitor was not spoken aloud. It didn't need to be. Torvald raised one hand, and the noise stopped. "You understand what you are saying," he said. "Not a question. I understand exactly what I'm saying." He studied her for a long moment. She had the sense he was not surprised, that somewhere beneath the procedure and the pale, still eyes, he had known since Bram opened that gate how this morning would end. Perhaps he had always known this about her. Perhaps that was why he had never fully trusted her, even when she had given him no reason not to. "Then the pack has no further claim on you," he said, "and you have no further claim on the pack." He said it simply, the way you'd state a fact about weather. The words were not designed to wound. They wounded anyway. "You have until midday to gather what is yours." She packed in silence. Her cabin was small enough that it didn't take long. Medicine pouch, hunting knife, flint, the good wool blanket, dried meat she'd prepared for the deep winter weeks ahead, a spare cloak. She moved through the familiar space with the focused efficiency of someone who understood that falling apart was a thing you did later, in private, when there was no audience and no decision left to make. The pup watched her from the hearth with his bandaged paw tucked beneath him. 3 wolves came to stand outside her door while she packed, as she could hear them through the wall. Not words, just presence, the specific quality of people who have appointed themselves witnesses to make sure the thing gets done. She did not acknowledge them. What she had not anticipated was Senna. Her oldest friend appeared in the doorway when the packing was nearly finished, slight and dark-haired, and wearing the expression of someone in genuine pain, trying very hard to look merely concerned. They had grown up in adjacent cabins, had learned to track together, had sat through the same council lessons, had once spent an entire winter night lost on the eastern ridge, and emerged from it the kind of friends that don't require much maintenance. Senna looked at her, then at the bag on the floor, then at the pup. She took one step into the cabin, then stopped. Something moved across her face. Intention, and the death of it. Her eyes dropped to the floor. "Senna," Elira said quietly, I can't. The words came out barely above a whisper. Elira, I have children here. I know. The law. I know. She crossed the room and gripped her friend's shoulder once, brief and firm. I know. Senna didn't look up as she left. The walk to the gate took 4 minutes and felt considerably longer. Wolves lined the path on both sides. Not a formal assembly, just the pack arranged the way packs arrange themselves when something significant was happening. Drawn by instinct and proximity and the particular pull of witnessing. Some watched with hard eyes and set mouths, the ones who had decided that the law was the law and sentiment was how packs died. Our others watched differently, with their gaze slightly averted, or their jaws a little tight, wearing the uncomfortable look of people who had voted for something they were no longer entirely sure they believed in. Elira looked straight ahead. The gate opened. She walked through. Behind her, she heard it close. Not the dramatic boom she might have imagined in another version of this moment, just the solid, mechanical sound of iron bolts sliding home, indifferent and final. She kept walking until the wall was behind her and the mountain was ahead and the snow was clean and unmarked in every direction. Then she stopped and looked down at the pup. He looked back up at her with those silver-edged eyes, patient as stone, his bandaged paw lifted slightly off the cold ground. She let out a long, slow breath. "You need a name," she said. The wind moved through the pines. "Lorien," she said. He yipped once, soft and certain, like he'd been waiting for her to catch up. She pulled her cloak tighter and walked north. The first week was the hardest. Not because of the cold. She had grown up in cold, had learned to read it the way other people read faces, and the mountains north of Frostfang Hollow were brutal but not unfamiliar. What was unfamiliar was the silence where a pack used to be, the absence of other heartbeats at night, the particular weight of knowing that if something went wrong out here, it went wrong alone. She built the shelter in a natural hollow, where 3 pines grew close enough together to share the work of a wall. She packed the gaps with dead fallen bark and banked snow against the outside for insulation. An old technique, not comfortable, but effective. By the 4th night, it held heat well enough that she stopped waking to check that Lorien was still breathing. Hunting alone was slower. She had always worked as part of a pair at minimum, one wolf to drive and one to cut off retreat. Now she had to be both, which meant longer approaches, more patience, more failures before the successes. She lost 2 deer in the first week that she would have taken cleanly with a partner. She ate a lot of dried rabbit and tried not to do the mental arithmetic on her supplies. Lorien helped in his way. He was growing at a rate that should have taken months, but seemed to be taking weeks. By the end of the first month, he was no longer the fragile, palm-sized creature she had carried from the ravine. His shoulders had broadened. His legs had lengthened into something built for real ground-covering speed. The silver fur had deepened in tone, less like fresh snow now, more like the sky an hour before dawn, that particular grey that isn't quite any colour at all. He learned to hunt mice and voles with a focus so intense it bordered on comic, belly flat to the snow, hindquarters raised, eyes locked, and then the tremendous self-serious pounce that worked perhaps 1 time in 5. The failures did not discourage him. He simply reset, relocated, and tried again with the same absolute conviction that this time would be different. Elira found herself laughing more than she had in years. He stole her left boot once and carried it to the far corner of the shelter with the evident intention of claiming it permanently. When she held out her hand and said "give," in the flat tone she used for commands, he dropped it immediately, not reluctantly, but cleanly, the way a trained wolf responded to a senior hunter. Then he sat and looked at her with an expression of such complete cooperation that she spent the rest of the afternoon quietly unsettled by it. He was too responsive, too attuned. She ran small tests, directional gestures she used with experienced hunters, stop signals, stay commands, and he obeyed them all without hesitation, with a precision that young wolves didn't develop until they were years into pack training. She told herself it meant nothing. The days built a rhythm. Hunt in the early morning when the light was low and the deer moved to the tree line. Return, skin, preserve. Rebuild what the wind took from the shelter walls. Work on the cache she was slowly digging into the hillside for deep winter storage. In the evenings, Lorien would climb into her lap, or attempt to. He was becoming large enough that climb was generous. And they would sit beside the fire while she sharpened her knife or repacked her medicine pouch, and he made the low, contented sound that she had stopped pretending wasn't doing something specific to the hollow feeling that exile had left in her chest. She was not happy exactly, but she was not broken either. And some nights, watching him chase the shadows that the firelight threw across the shelter walls, she thought that perhaps this was what purpose felt like when it arrived without asking permission. Then came the evening she stepped outside to check the weather and felt it. Eyes are not animal curiosity. She knew that sensation well enough, the passive awareness of a fox or a deer registering her presence. This was something else, deliberate, weighted. The specific quality of being watched by something that understood what watching meant. She scanned the tree line slowly. Nothing moved, but the feeling remained long after she went back inside, and Lorien, usually restless at night, sat perfectly still at the threshold, with his nose lifted toward the dark. She saw him for the first time 3 days later. Dawn. The light was the flat, directionless grey of early winter morning, and she had gone out to check the snares she'd set along the eastern ridge. Lorien padded beside her, close enough that his shoulder occasionally brushed her leg. A habit he'd developed recently, this casual maintenance of contact, as though he felt responsible for keeping track of her. She was crouching over the second snare, empty, resetting the tension in the wire, when Lorien stopped. Not the gradual deceleration of an animal losing interest. A full stop, all 4 feet planted, head lifted toward the tree line 40 yards ahead. Elira straightened slowly and followed his gaze. The wolf was standing at the edge of the pines, where the shadows were still thick enough to hide most of him. Most. What the shadows could not conceal was the size, an enormity that her mind initially refused, rationalizing it down to a trick of the light and the angle, until she shifted her position slightly, and the scale became undeniable. He was the largest wolf she had ever seen, larger than any wolf she had heard of. His head alone was level with her chest, and he was not close. His coat was black in the way that deep water was black. Not an absence of color, but a presence of depth, something that went further down than it had any right to. And his eyes, gold, not the pale amber common to mountain wolves, a deep, saturated gold, like firelight held inside glass, and they were fixed on her with an intelligence that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up in a way that had nothing to do with cold. She reached for the knife at her hip without looking away. He didn't move. She took one slow step to the left, putting herself between him and Lorien. The movement was instinct, the same instinct that had crouched over a trapped pup in a ravine before her mind had caught up with her body. Lorien made a small sound behind her, not fear, something closer to the opposite. She kept her eyes on the wolf, and her hand on the knife and waited. He watched her. A minute passed, perhaps two. The wind moved through the pines above them and disturbed nothing below. He stood with the absolute stillness of something that had never once in its life needed to prove itself through movement, and he watched her with those gold eyes, and he did not come closer. Then he turned and walked back into the trees. No threat display, no territory marking. He simply left, the black coat dissolving into shadow between the trunks until there was nothing there at all, and the forest looked exactly as it had before, and Ailira stood with her knife half drawn and her heart doing something irregular in her chest. Lorien pressed his nose against the back of her knee. He came back the next morning, same position, same stillness, same gold eyes tracking her movements across the clearing with an attention that felt less like predatory calculation and more like, she didn't have a word for it, study perhaps, assessment, the way you watch something you were trying to understand. She did not reach for her knife the second time. She still watched him back, just as carefully, and she still kept herself between him and Lorien. But the specific quality of her alertness shifted. Less the tension before a fight, more the tension before a conversation. When you are waiting to understand what kind of exchange this is going to be. He came the third morning, and the fourth, and by the fifth she had begun to notice the pattern. He appeared at dawn. He stayed for somewhere between 10 and 20 minutes. He never approached. He never threatened. And he was always watching Lorien. What she couldn't reconcile was Lorien's reaction. The pup was not afraid. That alone was strange. Lorien was sensible about genuine threats, would tuck close to her side when unfamiliar wolves passed within scenting distance of their territory. But when the black wolf appeared, he became animated in a different way entirely. Bright-eyed, ears forward, a restless, eager energy running through him like a current, held in check only by some instinct Ailira didn't fully understand. Once, he took 3 steps toward the tree line before she said his name. He stopped immediately, came back, but he kept looking. On the 7th morning, Ailira made a decision. She crossed the clearing. Steady pace, no threat display, eye knife sheathed. The approach you used when you wanted to communicate that you were not the danger in this situation, but you were also not prey. 20 yards, 15. The gold eyes tracked her without alarm. 10 yards. The black wolf held her gaze for one long, unreadable moment. Then he turned and walked into the forest and was gone. Ailira stood at the tree line alone. Behind her, Lorien made a sound she had never heard from him before, low and resonant, too large for his chest, older than anything a pup his age should have been producing, almost like a name. 300 miles south, a king was losing his patience. The war room of Moonspire Citadel occupied the entire top floor of the fortress's eastern tower, and on a clear day you could see 4 mountain ranges from its windows. Tonight, the windows were dark, and the maps on the long table had been there so many days their edges were beginning to curl. And High Alpha Kayla Varin had not slept in any meaningful way since the 3rd morning after his son disappeared. He stood at the head of the table with his hands flat on the map and his eyes moving across the terrain markings with the focused intensity of a man who was refusing, through sheer will, to arrive at the conclusion the evidence kept pointing toward. "The Northern Pass search," he said. His chief scout, a weathered wolf named Aldrich, did not look up from his own section of the map. They had all learned, in the past 2 weeks, not to meet the king's eyes directly when delivering reports. 3rd sweep completed this morning. No scent trail. The blizzard that came through on the 14th appears to have... I know what blizzards do to scent trails, Aldrich. Yes, my lord. Silence. Kaelor Varin was not a man who inspired descriptions of warmth. He was tall in the way that made rooms feel smaller, broad through the shoulders in the way that came from actual use rather than appearance, and his face had the quality of having been weathered into its current arrangement by years of decisions that carried real weight. He was 34 years old and looked both younger and considerably older, depending on the light. Right now, in the torchlight of the war room, he looked like something close to dangerous. Expand the search radius, he said, north and east. Every valley, every ridge, every abandoned shelter within 4 days' run of the last confirmed sighting. My lord, the men have been... Expand it. Aldrich nodded and said nothing further. The story of how the Alpha King's heir had come to be lost in the northern mountains was not a story Kaelor told. His advisors knew the broad shape of it. A journey disrupted, an escort separated in the storm, a pup gone from a camp that should have been secure, and they had learned not to probe the details. What they understood, collectively and with great clarity, was that the boy was everything. Kaelor's mate, Selara, had died the night their son was born. It had been a hard birth, a long one, and she had held the pup for 3 hours before the bleeding took her. 3 hours was not long. Kaelor had spent years since then doing the arithmetic of it, how much she had known him in that time, whether 3 hours was enough to leave a mark that would last, or whether the boy would grow up carrying something of her without knowing where it came from. He believed he would. He had named the pup Lorien, after the Northern Star his mate had always navigated by. The boy had her eyes. That was the part Kaelor did not allow himself to think about in company, because there was nothing he could do with it that was appropriate for a king in a war room surrounded by scouts and advisors. His son had her eyes and her particular quality of stillness, and the same way of watching things that suggested he was absorbing more than he appeared to be, and he was the only piece of Selara that the world had not yet taken. Kaelor had kept him close for 2 years because of this. He had failed at the one moment it mattered. "Find him," he said to the empty room, long after the scouts had filed out. 6 days north, while Lyra was becoming concerned. Lorien, her Lorien, the silver pup she had carried from a ravine in a blizzard, was no longer small by any reasonable definition. In 2 months, he had grown to the size of a full-grown wolf, his shoulders reaching her hip, his paws leaving impressions in the snow that she could fit both her hands inside. His strength was disproportionate even to his size. She had watched him move a fallen pine that had blocked the path to her snares, shouldering it aside with the focused ease of something that didn't fully understand why the task should be difficult. She told herself it was a northern breed, an unusual lineage. She was running out of ways to believe that. The royal scent she had noticed in the ravine had deepened with him, more distinct now, layered with something she still couldn't name. But that made her instincts go very quiet in the way they did before something significant happened. She was returning from the eastern snares on the 8th morning after the Black Wolf's last appearance, when Lorien stopped on the path and turned south. His nose lifted. His whole body went still in a way she had never seen from him. Not the playful pre-pounce stillness, not the alert watchfulness he used for strangers. Something older, something that recognized what it was sensing. In the valley below, between the tree line and the frozen river, 3 wolves were moving fast through the snow, tracking north, toward her cabin. She didn't sleep. She had sent Lorien inside at dusk, and barred the cabin door, and sat with her back against the wall and her knife across her knees, and listened to the forest the way her father had taught her. Not for sounds, but for the absence of them. The owls went quiet first, around the second hour of full dark, then the foxes, then the small shuffling movements of the animals that lived in the deadfall along the northern edge of the clearing. Silence, complete and deliberate, pressed against the cabin walls. Then the growl, low and coordinated, not one wolf but several, spread across different positions, which meant they had taken the time to surround the clearing before announcing themselves. Professionals then, not scouts, hunters. She was on her feet before the second growl finished. Lorien stood at the door, in the fur along his spine raised in a ridge, his body filling more of the doorway than it had any right to. She put her hand on his flank, steady, and he held, trembling with the effort of it. She lifted the bar and opened the door. There were 5 of them. They stood at the clearing's edge in a loose arc, human form, wearing the deep charcoal travelling cloaks of Moonspire's Royal Guard. The torches 2 of them carried threw orange light across the snow and made the shadows between the pines jump and shift. The lead hunter was a woman, tall, sharp-featured, with a particular economy of movement that came from years of tracking things that didn't want to be found. She looked at Elira. Then her eyes moved to Lorien, standing at Elira's side. "We are searching for the Alpha Heir," she said. Her voice carried the flat, a careful neutrality of someone who had rehearsed this conversation for many versions of how it might go. A silver wolf pup, approximately 2 months. She stopped. Lorien had stepped forward into the torchlight. The hunter's carefully maintained neutrality lasted perhaps 2 more seconds. Then it didn't. She went pale in a way that had nothing to do with cold, and the hunter to her left made a sound that was not quite a word, and the one holding the right torch took an involuntary step backward. They could smell him. Elira watched the recognition move through them like a current, the scent hitting first, then the colouring, then the eyes, and the accumulated weight of all 3 arriving at a conclusion that clearly none of them had genuinely expected to reach tonight. "That's," the left hunter started. "Ah, yes," the lead hunter said quietly. The 5 of them looked at Elira with an expression she couldn't immediately classify. Not hostility, something more complicated. The look of people rapidly recalculating everything they thought they understood about the situation they had walked into. She was still working out what to say when the tree line exploded. He came from the north, where the pines were thickest, where she had never once seen the black wolf emerge before. He cleared the distance between the forest and the clearing in 3 strides that barely seemed to touch the ground, and the 5 hunters scattered without a word, not fleeing, but moving aside, with the automatic deference of people whose bodies understood the hierarchy before their minds caught up. The black wolf landed in the center of the clearing, and the snow compressed under him like the ground itself was making room. Then he shifted. It was not the slow, agonized transformation she had heard described in old stories. It was fast and total. Black fur receding, massive frame restructuring, the wolf becoming something else between one breath and the next. The torchlight caught the transition, and she saw it clearly, all of it, and still her mind spent a full second refusing the evidence. The man who stood in the clearing was tall, dark-haired, dressed in the travelling clothes of someone who had been in wolf form for long enough that formality had stopped being practical. His face was angular and weathered, and wore an expression that made every other expression she had ever seen on a person look uncomplicated. His eyes were gold. She had last seen them 40 yards away, at the tree line, patient and watching. He dropped to one knee in the snow. "My son," he said. The sound that came out of Lorien was the same resonant, ancient thing she had heard once before. The sound too large for his chest, the sound like a name. He crossed the clearing in 4 bounds and hit the man's chest hard enough to stagger him. And Kayla Varin, the Alpha King, the massive black wolf had been the Alpha King, caught him and held him with both arms and pressed his face into the silver fur and stayed there. The 5 hunters knelt simultaneously. Elira stood in her doorway with her knife at her side and the cold coming through her boots and the world rearranging itself around a fixed point she couldn't quite look at directly. The pup she had pulled from the trap, the pup who had stolen her boot and chased snowflakes and licked her hand in a ravine in a blizzard, was the heir to the throne of Moonspire. Eventually, Kayla lifted his head. He looked at her across the clearing with those gold eyes, and she made herself hold the gaze because the alternative was looking away, and she was not going to look away. He stood. One hand remained on Lorien's head. "You pulled him from an iron trap," he said. "You carried him through a blizzard. You gave up your pack, your home." He paused, and something moved across his face that the torchlight wasn't bright enough to fully illuminate. "You kept him alive and safe for 2 months in the northern wilderness, alone." She said nothing. "You saved the royal bloodline," he said, "when every law you lived under told you not to." The clearing was very quiet. Kayla Varin looked at her for a long moment, and then he said the thing that stunned even his own hunters into stillness. "You will never be unprotected again. That is not a courtesy." His voice carried the particular quality of a man who did not make many promises and had never once broken one. "That is a debt, and I pay my debts." Lorien pressed his nose against the king's hand and looked across at Elira. His silver eyes caught the torchlight and held it. They reached Frostfang Hollow on the 3rd day. Kayla had not announced himself in advance. That, Elira understood, was intentional. He rode in wolf form for most of the journey. She had learned, in those 3 days of travel, that he did this when he was thinking, when the human shape felt too small for whatever was moving through him. His hunters flanked them at a respectful distance. Lorien moved between Elira and the king with the satisfied air of something that had always known this arrangement was inevitable and was simply pleased that everyone else had caught up. She had not yet decided what to do with any of it. The gates of Frostfang Hollow opened before they reached them. Word had travelled faster than the party, apparently. Someone on the outer watch had recognized the royal guard markings, and the news had moved through the pack in the way news always moved through small, frightened communities, instantly and with significant embellishment. By the time Carlos shifted back to human form at the pack's entrance, the entire Elder Council was already assembled in the yard. Torvald stood at the front. He looked at the king, and then at Elira, standing at the king's right side, then at Lorien pressing his shoulder against her leg. Something happened to his face that she had never seen there before. It took her a moment to identify it. It was fear. Carlo did not raise his voice once during the confrontation. He didn't need to. He stood in the center of the council yard with Lorien visible beside him and laid out the sequence of events in the flat, precise tone of a man who had spent the journey composing exactly this accounting and was delivering it now with the care it deserved. The pup found in the trap, the exile of the wolf who had saved him, the 2 months his heir had spent in the northern wilderness, kept alive by the compassion of a woman this council had cast out into a blizzard. The elders stood in a crescent before him and went collectively, "I'm very still." She broke our law, Torvald said. It came out with considerably less conviction than the same words had carried 3 months ago in the council hall. Yes, Kaelor said, and my son is alive because of it. He let that sit for a moment. Your law would have left the future Alpha King to die in an iron trap. Nobody spoke. The law was written to protect this pack, he continued. You used it to protect your fear. He looked at each elder in turn, unhurried. Those are not the same thing, and you know it. You have always known it. The judgment he delivered was precise and without theatre. The Elder Council was stripped of its authority to rule on matters of exile, effective immediately. Those decisions would require Moonspire confirmation going forward. Torvald himself was removed from his position as head elder. The pack's charter would be reviewed. It was not, Elira thought, the destruction of Frostfang Hollow. It was something more considered than that. It was correction. She stood and watched it happen and felt less than she had expected to feel. The anger she had carried north through the snow 3 months ago had apparently spent itself somewhere in the wilderness, burned through by the more immediate requirements of survival and the strange, uncomplicated satisfaction of a life that had become, against all reasonable expectation, her own. Kaelor made the offer that evening. They sat in the pack's meeting hall, just the two of them, Lorien spread across both their feet with the boneless contentment of an animal who had decided this was permanent. And he described the position plainly. Royal Protector to the Alpha Heir, a residence at Moonspire. Work she was suited for, he said, with the directness she had come to expect from him in 3 days of travel. You've already been doing the job, he said. I'm proposing to make it official. And Lorien, she asked. They both looked down. Lorien had his chin on her knee and was looking up at her with the expression he deployed when he wanted something and was reasonably confident he was going to get it. Kaela's mouth did something brief that she was beginning to recognize as the closest he came to a smile. He refuses to leave your side. I've accepted this. She looked at the pup, who was no longer a pup. The future king of Moonspire, the heir to an ancient throne. The creature who had once stolen her left boot and considered it a reasonable decision. All right, she said. Years later, and when Lorien stood at his full height and cast a shadow that made grown wolves step aside, he would still tell the story. Not in formal halls or royal addresses, in smaller moments, around fires, in the quiet after hunts, to the young wolves who hadn't yet learned to distinguish between strength and hardness. He would tell them about the blizzard and the trap, and the woman who had stopped walking toward safety and turned toward a sound instead, about the pack that called mercy weakness, about the wilderness winter that had been, despite everything, the truest home he had ever known. And he always ended it the same way, in the same words, because some truths wore better plain. Fear builds walls, he would say. Mercy builds kingdoms. And the strongest thing a wolf can choose is to remain gentle in a world that rewards neither. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe.